Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
On Saturday night, the White House Correspondents' Dinner was interrupted by the sound of gunfire. Despite being able to bring multiple weapons into the hotel and reach the perimeter of the dinner, Cole Allen was quickly taken down and apprehended. Prior to the events on Saturday, the 31-year-old received a mechanical engineering degree from Caltech and a master's in computer science from California State University. He went on to provide tutoring for students. While going to school at Caltech, Allen regularly attended Pasadena United Reformed Church. He appears to have grown up in church since his father is in church leadership. And even in his manifesto, he continued to identify as a Christian. His voter registration listed no party preference, though he did donate $25 to a Kamala Harris super PAC once. But one thing was clear from his manifesto. Allen was very opposed to the Trump administration. He called himself the friendly federal assassin, and he wrote, "I am a citizen of the United States of America. What my representatives do reflects on me, and I am no longer willing to permit a pedophile, rapist, and traitor to coat my hands with his crimes." During one part of his manifesto, he brought up an objection from Christian theology. He said, "Objection 1. As a Christian, you should turn the other cheek." Then he responded, "Rebuttal. Turning the other cheek is for when you yourself are oppressed. I'm not the person raped in a detention camp. I'm not the fisherman executed without trial. I'm not a school kid blown up or a child starved or a teenage girl abused by the many criminals in this administration. Turning the other cheek when someone else is oppressed is not Christian behavior. It is complicity in the oppressor's crimes." It brings up a very important conversation for us to have because these aren't the words of a mentally unstable person who appears to have the need to be hospitalized, or the words of an angry person who allowed their anger to control them. These are the words of a Christian who is responding to real injustice by attempting to live out his theology of justice as violent retribution. In a piece for Baptist News Global titled How American Religion Inspired Cole Allen's Violence, Josh Olds put it this way, "It's not the ramblings of a madman or an incoherent screed. Allen's tone is somber and desperate, broken, yet resolved. These are the words of a man who has given long and hard thought to his actions. Cole Thomas Allen was not searching for fame. He does not hate America. He is not mentally unstable. Rather, he is the natural and inevitable byproduct of our political system, a system whose primary solution is violence." Of course, Republicans are using this as an opportunity to claim the Democrats and people on the left have a problem of violence. They're offering virtually no awareness of the violent rhetoric of Trump or of the injustices Trump is perpetrating. None of us should agree with Allen's violence, but that doesn't mean the Republicans are right to enact the dehumanizing policies they've been enacting. And it doesn't mean the problem of violence in U.S. politics is a one-sided affair. According to the Public Religion Research Institute, 80% of Democrats believe the failure of political leaders to condemn the violent rhetoric of their own followers contributes significantly to violence, compared to just 60% of Republicans. Regarding public displays of hate symbols like Nazi flags and swastikas, PRRI found that 76% of Democrats believe these symbols fuel political violence, compared with just 51% of Republicans. With those percentages, it's no wonder that PRRI says analysts point to strong evidence that political violence is more often committed by right-wing extremists than by left-wing actors. But despite the violence coming more from the right than from the left, PRRI has found that one of the leveling factors is age. According to a Harvard youth poll, 40% of Americans aged 18 to 29 across party lines believe that political violence may be acceptable under certain circumstances. This tracks with data that found 4 in 10 young people believe that Luigi Mangione assassinating United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson was justified. All of these factors put together create a complex picture, especially when considering how it may have played into the shooting at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Despite having the administration that is the victim of violence in this story, the right is more supportive of violence than the left. This has angered people on the left like Cole Allen. And while many on the right claim to have the market cornered on Christianity, Cole Allen identified as a Christian. Yet, while progressive Christians tend to emphasize restorative justice rather than retributive justice, Allen, who may or may not have been progressive, opposed the Trump administration while embracing retribution. In fact, he used Christian theologies of standing up for the marginalized to justify his violence. And like many of the shooters in recent years, he was young, part of an age group that is more open to political violence. However, there are others who stand up for the marginalized in nonviolent ways. Perhaps the most well-known name over the past century was Martin Luther King Jr. We're all aware of his ministry and his speeches that he gave as an adult, but what made him into the man he became? After all, a major part of the story here is violence being justified by Christian theology and opposition to oppression among those who are young. What might the youth of Martin Luther King Jr. reveal to us that could help our young people heal and move toward restoration rather than violence? Lerone Martin is a King Scholar and a professor at Stanford University. He's releasing a new book next week titled Young King: The Making of Martin Luther King Jr. It's a really unique look into MLK's childhood, his years in college, and how he developed into the preacher who was committed to pursuing justice through nonviolence. MLK Jr. is the direct contrast to the young men we're seeing in the news today who are pursuing justice through violence. So I sat down with Dr. Lerone Martin to discuss. Over the weekend, we had another assassination attempt at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and the shooter wrote a manifesto in which he mentioned his complaints against the Trump administration and said he thought that violence was the only answer. How did Martin Luther King Jr. come to reject that idea so firmly, and what did he see as the real alternative?
King thought about this question really deeply and profoundly. And from the first perspective, King would talk about the pragmatism. He would go around to pool halls and in Chicago, speak with members of street gangs and try to talk with them through this cycle, as he called it, of violence. And King would always say that, it's impractical, first and foremost, right? The idea that you could solve your problems with violence for most individuals was impractical in terms of just the practicality of using violence to eliminate one's enemies, especially for African Americans as being a minority in this country. But more importantly than the pragmatism of it, for King, it was a spiritual matter. And he felt that violence only begat more violence. And if you were to use violence to try to bring about your political aims, that it would only produce more violence. And so King felt it was very important that one's means and ends were commensurate. So if you sought a society of peace and of love and equality, you needed to use peace and love to get there. Now, what many people misunderstand about King is that they think that his nonviolence is the same thing as being passive. And for King, that's completely not true. You channel this nonviolence using soul force into nonviolent direct action. You actually do something. You protest, you use economic withdrawal, you draw attention to the issue, but you don't use violence to achieve your goals. And for King, this is a spiritual thing. It's something that he encounters while he's at Morehouse from listening to his professors lecture, primarily Benjamin Elijah Mays, and as well as Professor George Kelsey, both of whom were taken by what Gandhi had done in India. And they're lecturing on this to Martin King as a youngster. So he picks this up there. He also reads Henry David Thoreau about civil disobedience. And so King encounters these ideas while in college and is really taken by them. And I think these are ideas that he takes with him for the rest of his life, and he tries to teach on them and tell us about them throughout his ministry and activism.
So, in the manifesto that the shooter had come out with from the White House Correspondents' Dinner, one of the things that he mentions is he makes the case against turning the other cheek when you yourself are oppressed. But he says that you're not supposed to turn the other cheek when someone else is oppressed, and that to turn the other cheek when someone else is oppressed is complicity in the oppressor's crimes. So, how would King wrestle with that tension between nonviolence and the urgency of defending the oppressed?
You see, I think this is another example, and I appreciate you reading that, of conflating turning the other cheek with being passive and doing nothing. We know that King didn't believe that if we saw someone being oppressed, that we should do nothing. I mean, this is the reason he's in Memphis, right? And he says famously, like, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So King was in Memphis in 1968 to help with the sanitation workers for that very reason. He saw them being oppressed. He had another campaign in the works, the Poor People's Campaign, but went to Memphis to help. And so I think Martin King would tell us that we certainly want to stop and help people, as he would use from the text in the Bible about the Good Samaritan. When we see people on the road of life who have been beaten and oppressed, we certainly stop to help them. I think for Martin King, it's about how we help them. And he would argue that we need to do so nonviolently, but we need to do so in a way that it involves direct action, brings attention to the issue, and causes all of those around to have their conscience and their heart pierced by the issue. So it's not a situation where one is passive if one sees another person being oppressed, but it's about how you react. And even turning the other cheek is a reaction that Jesus tried to teach about, that is not passive, but is actually trying to flip the power in the situation. So I think it's important for us to understand that to turn the other cheek is not a passive move, but it's about being engaged in a nonviolent way.
How would he see that power? Because I think a lot of times we tend to want to embrace a power over another, but there seems to be a different kind of power in not accepting that narrative and offering that more restorative, transformative power, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think for Martin King, there's many ways to obtain power, right? There's the idea of bringing attention to your issue, so that everyone is exposed to the evil that is occurring or the oppression that is occurring. It's about changing the narrative, right? Oftentimes in our society, those who are oppressed can be we can be told that somehow they deserve the oppression or they've done it to themselves. By engaging in nonviolent direct action, King is trying to flip the narrative and show people these are individuals who are being nonviolent. They simply want access to their rights, whether that be voting or public accommodations or citizenship. And look how they're being treated. And we saw that in his history, how that changed the narrative, how that changed the way people thought about the African American freedom struggle. And I think that what King is trying to show us is there are many levers of which we could grasp when it comes to power, including using media such as podcasts and others, using television to shape the narrative around certain issues dealing with oppression. And I think King is a great example of how to do that.
So in your book, you write that King was not born a hero, but was made. What are some specific experiences or influences in his childhood that most shaped his sense of justice and his commitment to nonviolence?
Well, one of the things that King says that struck him around poverty is being born, of course, as he was in 1929, and coming of age and seeing poverty around him. He said that he started to realize that he had everything he needed and more, and some of his friends he would see who were going without. And so that shaped him early on, he says, around poverty. Another situation that shaped him around racism is he says that he had a really close friend as a little boy, and they used to play together. He was a white young man. And when it came time for them to go to school, King says that um, the white boy's parents told King they could no longer play together because King was an N-word. And King says that shaped him very profoundly. That was his first memory of encountering racism. And he says, in an honest way, he says that at that moment in his life, he had purpose to hate all white people. So this was a moment where King wrestles with racism in his life. A turning point in that area comes around the time when he's in college. He, number one, goes to Connecticut and picks tobacco on a tobacco farm in Connecticut and is experiencing life outside of Jim Crow. A second moment for King is in college when he joins an interracial collegiate ministry where there are students from Morehouse and the other AUC schools and students from Emory University, where they get together and talk about race problems. And King says that this is a moment where he realizes there are countless young white brothers and sisters who are interested in trying to remove racial injustice from American life. So those experiences shaped him around race. And finally, as it relates to violence, um, King says that he never really liked to fight. In fact, it was his father was actually embarrassed. His father will say in an interview that King would come home having been beat up at school, and King's father would threaten him and say, "If you come home one more time and having been beat up at school, you're going to have to face me." And so King goes through this period where he feels as if he's not measuring up to his father, right? Then, as a result of the death of his grandmother, he goes through a period where King calls a general rebellion. He starts doubting the resurrection of Jesus. He starts fighting. He starts wrestling. He even smacks his brother during a game of Monopoly that got too intense. So he goes through a period where he actually is angry at the loss of his grandmother and actually engages in violence. But King will say that anytime that happened, he always regretted it. And eventually he comes back to himself in college, as I said earlier, being exposed to the thoughts of Gandhi, Henry David Thoreau, Benjamin Elijah Mays, George Kelsey, that he comes back to himself and really begins to embrace this idea of nonviolence.
So, how did his relationship with Coretta play into all of this?
Coretta is such an important figure in Martin's life. And Martin realizes when he decided he's going to go into the ministry, he recognizes the importance of having a partner that's going to journey with him. And many people have often thought that King sort of takes Coretta along and teaches her everything. But as I chronicle in the book, King says in an interview a couple years into their marriage that many people believe that he taught her everything. And he tells a journalist, quote, "I wish for my masculine ego's sake, I could say that I taught Coretta everything. But in many ways, Coretta has taught me." And I chronicle that early on in their relationship as they're dating. He immediately after the first date says, "You have everything I've ever wanted in a wife." Coretta's not sure. She doesn't think he's very handsome. She's a little concerned that he's only 5'7". Like she likes tall men, right? There's all these things that you can imagine in your early 20s and dating. But their intellectual exchange, their conversation, their ideas about changing society. And in fact, Coretta at this time when they're dating, she's more of an experienced activist than King is. She's been to the Progressive Party National Convention. She's participated in nonviolent protest. She's been even in Ohio at Antioch College. She's protested some practices in the local school district that won't allow her to be a student teacher because she's African American. So Coretta's an experienced activist by the time she meets Martin, much more than him. King recognizes that. And so in their dating relationship, you get a chance to see not only just a romantic love begin to grow, but an intellectual exchange begin to grow. And she's sending him books and telling him to read books, and he's commenting on them in their love letters. They're talking about society. They're talking about nonviolence and poverty and war. And so in the dating relationship, you get a chance to see not just the game of cat and mouse and chase that comes along with dating in one's 20s, but also the development of an intellectual exchange of between the two of them, where you can see that Martin is growing, and a great deal of that growth comes from Coretta.
Where do you think some of that came from? Because in a lot of like fundamentalist Christianity, it's about patriarchy, it's about male headship. And you mentioned his dad being a fundamentalist. Was there some kind of relationship with his mom that made him more open to learning from women instead of just, lording over them?
Absolutely. His mother, his grandmother are two women who are in a long line of women who really shape him and he learns from. His grandmother, he called her Mama. She lived with him. She taught him. His aunt Ida used to read to him from the encyclopedia and the newspapers. Christine says that's where King developed his love of books, is from his aunt Ida. His mother teaches him music. He goes on the road and sings with her. So he learns music from his mother. Local librarians are allowing him to check out books, even though he's too young to get a library card. His elementary school teacher, she teaches him, introduces him to Langston Hughes and performing poetry. A high school teacher named Sarah Grace Bradley is the woman that King says gives him his first formal instructions in public speaking. So there's a long line of women that I chronicle in this book that helped to shape him. So by the time it comes for him meeting Coretta, it's not foreign to him that he's learning from women. Now, King will, like many men of his era, um, think about that learning in a particular way, that learning typically happens behind closed doors and is private. But there's no question, and he admits this himself, that Coretta shapes him, and Coretta is just one of many women in King's life who sparks his intellectual growth.
So you talk in your book about how King renounced his faith at one point only to find it again. And I know a lot of people, especially over the last 10 years, have left Christianity, especially in white Christian nationalist spaces.
Mhm.
And for us to go back to that world would feel like embracing violence and retribution again. And so, but what was it that attracted King to go back to Christianity? And was the Christianity he went back to different in some way than the Christianity he left?
Great question. I appreciate that, Rick. The answer is yes. King says that the moment that he moves from being agnostic, he says, to embracing faith is in college. He takes a class with Professor George Kelsey called The Bible. As I chronicle in the book, it's the only class King gets an A in while he's in college. And King says that that class changed the way he thought about the Bible, that he finally saw a faith that he had previously with his, what he would say, his fundamentalist father, who preached that everything in the Bible was a historical fact. He moved from seeing those stories about animals who talk, oceans or seas that spread. He said he moved from looking at those moments as historical facts, and George Kelsey helps him to see the moral truths beneath those stories. We could argue it's where King gets exposed to historical criticism. And King says that allows him to come back to faith and embrace faith and see faith as something that is essential to life and is essential to the struggle of African Americans. And he will say that he then embraces nonviolence. He sees in Jesus the principle of nonviolence. And then he says he sees in Gandhi the technique of nonviolence. So the faith that he comes to by the time he is in his junior year of college is different than the faith that he had embraced as a young man, but it's a faith that will empower him to change himself and his community in America even more broadly.
So a lot of us carry wounds that are really born in us when we were kids. It sounds similar to, a lot of us
Mm,
have father issues like King had. I can imagine King going to a playground, fe working through his feelings, just like a lot of us did.
yeah.
Like, and we often talk about coming to embrace our inner child. And perhaps some of this might be a little speculative, but I'm curious, like, if our inner child could have a conversation with the child version of MLK Jr., what do you think
Mm,
MLK Jr. might say to our inner child that would feel like hope for justice?
mm. That's a great question. I know some psychologists are probably really interested in this. I would say a college age King, which is still a teenager. He went to school at 15, went to college at 15. I would say that King would say to our 15-year-old selves that we have to find a way to change America. His friends say that he would run around campus and constantly talk about why he wanted to be a lawyer and why he shouldn't be a minister, because he thought a lawyer would be more respectable, a lawyer would have an impact on society. His friends say, and I chronicle this in the book, it got so bad they started to avoid him because they wanted to talk about normal college stuff. And all he wanted to do was talk about how he was going to change the world and how he wanted the world to be a better place. So I think of our 15-year-old selves and that 15-year-old King, I think he'd want to engage us in a conversation of, what are you going to do to change your community? What are you going to do to change the world? What are we going to do to change these miserable conditions? I think that was what he would say. And I think he would engage us in a conversation of figuring out how that desire to change the world meets up with our own talent. And Martin King finally discovered that it was the ministry for him, that the gifts that God had given him was perfectly expressed through the ministry to change society. And I think he would engage us as well to figure out how our talents and gifts meet the world's needs in order to help us to make the world and our society a better place.
Well, in your intro to your book, you talk about how, many of us think about King and we just know the adult version of King. And I thought that what your approach was really interesting because it introduces us to the younger version that formed him, and I think
Yes.
it brings a humanity to him that we often miss. And so I think your work is going to be really helpful for us, and I appreciate you coming on and sharing that with us.
Rick, it's a blessing and a privilege to be with you. I really appreciate you having me on.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Monday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.